Thank you so much for the invitation. I think the opportunity to share this project, this ongoing project now that we've been doing for about 5 years, is something that we want to share, especially with our affiliates, our strong relationships with CLACS and other affiliates on campus in particular, given the fact that we want to bridge something that divides many of our families. And part of this project is to bring them together, which is the U.S.-Mexico border, to make sure that Latin America and Mexico and Latin America and here in the United States, we share our stories, that what binds us are those stories. And from that place comes the Digna Rabia Journal, something that I felt could usher a conversation between students who take our classes in Chicanx and Chicanx Studies with their families in particular, but also with the broader community. That is the ability to storytell and to collect stories and to record them is to make sure that they don't get erased or that we wield it as a weapon, especially in this moment of xenophobia and anti-immigrant discourse. And so the Digna Rabia is titled precisely for that reason, this question of dignified rage, a rage that we can do so in our knowledge production. And it's something that began, and I'll mention this in several points. I'm thinking of this as an opportunity to share for possible faculty or instructors or educators, but also students who think that creating a journal like this can only be done by institutions who have huge budgets. And they can. Huge budgets would be nice, especially for something like this. But it's something that I came as, again, to show that we produce knowledge. Our students produce knowledge, our families produce knowledge, our families' families produce knowledge. And to have that be recognized by this university is just a cherry on top. It's not necessarily what the goal was or the intention was, but it's definitely something that I cherish, given now that in its 4th volume, we are now a part of the Ethnic Studies Library, which is really, I think, an amazing part. I think this question of telling our stories, again, comes with the fact that while the location of the university is a place of being able to think about our stories and hear the stories of many, we often view them through lenses that don't capture the struggles, don't capture the power of the word. And what I found, given that this project began with a moment, just like the one that we're in right now. In 2016, first time that I taught my Mexican and Central American migration class to a beautiful sea of brown faces, who at that moment, if you can remember in fall of 2016, they were paying attention to the news and to presidential debates and so forth, where their communities were being called rapists, bad hombres, and all kinds of other languages that was being spewed by presidential candidates, but also on the media. And the events, of course, that transpired that led to the election of Donald Trump meant several things for me. It was a pretty rude awakening to what those 4 years were for many of our students. That everything that I had attempted to engage and encounter them with in regards to Mexican migration was not enough for the grief that came the day after the election. And at that moment, I was, I think, very much focused around what kinds of weapons can we wield and create for ourselves, not only for our defense of our communities, but also to create new worlds, to expand our understanding of that. And one of them that I still insisted on was the telling of our stories, especially the telling of the stories of the people that brought us here. Our grandparents, our parents, our family members, our community members, our loved ones. And it began And it evolved into a whole series of projects that I now implement in my classes to think about that form of knowledge production that's important given, again, the attacks on our communities. So Digna Rabia is the first one that again as an online journal, now I have physical copies of, but also as still an online journal. Last year's production of children's books in my Chicano 50 class, my introduction to Chicano history, which is responding to the banning of books, especially ethnic studies, gender and women's studies books in places like Florida and Texas. Podcasting, which is about storytelling. Something that I tell my students is that my mother worked at the seamstress for years. One thing that she always used to come and remind us of is in her day, in the repetitive nature of being a seamstress, was listening to Spanish radio on AM radio, and how podcasting could be a way, again, of informing and talking about the news of the day to our families and to our colleagues. And then new technologies and media like augmented reality that can, again, tell the hidden stories of even the campus in regards to an augmented reality walking tour that highlights the history of activism, especially by students of color on the Berkeley campus. And these are all projects that have stemmed from the spark that Digna Rabia helped with years ago. And I begin with this question of oral histories because what kind of takeaway do you want to have in a class focused on immigration? You could have, for instance, conversations over policy, and especially since we have so many students that want to go into policy. You can go into conversations over that history and how to teach that history and so forth. And at the same time, since many of the students who take the course have that intimate knowledge of either having themselves migrated across borders, whether internal or external, or have family members that continue to do so, that it is responding to this concept that I focus in my classes at the beginning of most of my classes, which is responding to the social construction of a people without a history, that we are caricatures, as Leo Chavez would argue in his book, The Latino Threat Narrative, that those caricatures can be filled by, for instance, Haitian immigrants eating pets, to, again, we're all somehow criminals, whether or not, depending on how we came to this country. And the task here with Digna Rabia is not to respond with us being, or for my students to think of ourselves just solely as good subjects, neither as bad subjects. It's to go against the very production of the good and bad subject that reinforces the very idea of borders and creates binaries where binaries didn't exist or shouldn't exist. And so in that context, I thought about it in these particular bullet points, that the personal is political. That is, that when we tell our stories, we are as much politicizing the question about our existence in any particular place, especially in the place that views us as an external other or foreign other. How we personalize our migration stories. That is how we, and our students are constantly thinking about this, especially the stories of their parents, the little bits and pieces of the story that they know, right? That they've collected. But what about the rest of that story? The very difficult stories that your parents, grandparents, or other family members have not told you. And why haven't they told you? We get into that both in the class, but also in the journal. That is, that sense of being able to tell those difficult stories and hold them. Of course, like I mentioned, debunking the quote unquote immigrant narrative, that this whole immigrant narrative is, again, construction of we're worthy of. We're constantly producing a narrative that it shows the case that. This tries to, again, pinpoint not that we're worthy of. Our stories can hold their weight. They hold the weight of history. And so I think in that context, what that means and so forth. And then the most important, and I put this one here, is having no regrets. And that one, I didn't put regrets, even though I would have loved to put regrets, but it's regrets because I tell students that when I was a Cal student in the late 90s, me and my cousin Irma had a similar project to collect oral histories, and my cousin Irma collected the oral histories of my grandmother, Beatriz Mendoza, right before she would rapidly, like her memory loss rapidly declined due to dementia and Alzheimer's. And to be able to record her stories, talk to her about her upbringing and so forth, is something that we still cherish, that we hold, not only because we can listen to her voice, but also have that story. Given that many of our, again, our families don't have the opportunity to document those stories. So I tell students not to have any regrets when they interview, whether they're parents or even themselves. Some of them do kind of a self reflection of their migration story, because they are, they won't regret having them for future generations, for family members, for people to be able to read and really be empowered by the stories. This builds an archive. When we do this, it builds an archive. It insists on a particular type of archive, a living, breathing archive that people can see in the Word and see both in, whether it be in a virtual online format or now in paper, that word, and it means something to have it like that. I've had plenty of students who have shared with us that upon reading the journal, their parents, of course, started to cry, and I don't do this so that we can start bawling, but it just so happens. And that their parents feel so, like, besides being responsible for sending their children to Cal, and that's an accomplishment for them, that now their story is also a part of what Cal represents in regards to knowledge production. And I think that connection is something that we should cherish as well. And to truly do that is to make the university truly a site of knowledge retrieval for the purpose of building community, not for the purpose, of course, of commodifying the stories or somehow placing them in, and warehousing them, but to really learn from those stories and so forth. So this is the background to what we become Digna Rabia, the digital journal for Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx Studies. In its fourth now volume, it began with the oral histories and research projects of students in my course, which have steadily increased in terms of them taking the class. And what I wanted to present to you all is the different steps that goes into producing this. And I'll pass out these for you all to see so that you can kind of visually see the how it's grown. It has grown tremendously. Just think about this is like one of the first ones we've been, and this is the most recent one. It's now a yellow book with all the phone numbers and so forth. So yes, it has definitely grown in terms of as students have taken this, not only the course, but also opportunity to develop their knowledge of the field, and especially around immigration. And these are the two volumes for this year that have come out. This one in particular is for the immigration class, and the other one was part of my Zapatista course that I've taught twice now in my time here at Cal. And that one is what the Zapatistas have referred to as a comparte, a series of partnerships and sharing of art, production of art, poetry, to build across difference. And they've done this in various formats, and people have really bought into this idea of a comparte, as we have a long tradition in Latin America, for instance, of performance art, visual art, floricantos that have been a part of how Chicana and Chicano artists and activists, for instance, have built connections in Mexico from the 60s, 70s, even to the present. So the comparte is definitely something that resonates across Latin America and the world in relationship to the sharing of knowledge and so forth. And the process. I think, given that I might be talking not only to students, but a diverse set of people, I integrate the building of the journal as a part of doing research. Students at Cal
love doing research. It's kind of makes me sick sometimes. That they come and they want to do research, which is, you know, actually a pretty like fascinating thing. Like when I was a student, it wasn't that big of a thing. I don't think I said the word research as much as students want to, but how they evolve and understand the concept of research is important. They want the steps. They want to know that each step has an importance and that it leads eventually to a finished product. And this beautiful finished product begins with sharing in this main project that my class does, the opportunity to do various things. One, write an oral history of someone who has a story of migration. So it doesn't necessarily have to be someone from Latin America or Mexico or Central America, but someone who has the experience of having migrated. Two, you could choose also to do a conventional research project on a topic of having to do with Mexican and Central migration. So we see people, for instance, do a research paper on detention centers or children crossing the border, having to do with COVID and the impact on immigrant communities. A whole series of different kinds of topics. And then finally, I give them an option to write about and find out more on an immigrant rights organization that's either local or national or somewhere where they're from. And that gives a opportunity for them to research and highlight the work that people are doing on the ground to make sure that our families are protected and that they, again, can live a dignified life. As you can imagine, as any professor on this campus or instructor who teaches around conducting research, there are several steps here. First, the proposal, the abstract in terms of students' proposal, what they're going to do. And they have to develop in that proposal either an annotated bibliography or a questionnaire, something that they're now building to ask a person or a set of people for the oral history. And that's an important first step. Why? Because most of the time I talk to students about that, they have yet to really think about what they would ask. So you see that the questions themselves limit, sometimes not in terms of open-endedness, but they limit the scope of finding out about someone's life. And I let them know again, no regrets, no regrets. Make sure to ask as much. If someone is allowing you or giving you the opportunity to learn about themselves, like share their story, ask every possible question you can. Learn all the tea as much as they want to share. And of course, there are, given our community, different levels of their status or degrees of status in the country. And I always tell them to be responsible in regards to their status in the country, to make sure that not only anonymity, but also just in terms of anything that could identify. And many of our families, of course, have many of these stories, all of us do, especially who have that migration story. So to take real responsibility, because you are now going to be the steward of that story as you start writing and collecting it. I offer interview techniques and also ask them, as a more recent incorporation into the journals, the opportunity to add photos that they can either scan or use and so forth. Because the photos, and I know here, there's folks who are really good with cinema, like with film and photos and so forth, that the power of that can frame so much about the story. And there's an element to it in the photo collection that I've added just just to enter into this question of storytelling, and that's through augmented reality. The way that we can use some of the new media as a way of telling a story within a story. In this case, a story within a story within a story. If that makes sense. And the journal actually emerged out of a small grant that I got from the Creative Discovery Grant, which no longer actually exists, but at that time was helpful in getting trained in some of these different technologies, both in the use of the Adobe Creative Suite and Adobe InDesign to create the template for the journal, and also in the use of augmented reality through an app that you have available on your phone if you ever wanted to use it, called Artivide. The project initiated from during the time of our shelter-in-place orders in terms of COVID-19, so between 2020 and 2021. And it focused, the first part of it focused on the impact of COVID-19 on our students in a class that I taught on Chicano ethnography. I made them do photo galleries as a way of writing ethnographies or creating ethnographies versus the traditional way. And from that, I saw so much of the beauty of storytelling. I had students, of course, during COVID that were living not in their homes, but right outside of hospitals because of family members that were sick, in hotel rooms, that were, for instance, creating photo galleries of them and their siblings during the time that they had to take classes, and what it meant to be a student while doing so. So these kind of photo galleries with augmented reality started this question for me, like what would it be like for us to create these online journals that represented much of this? And that first journal actually included that. The first journal also included the oral histories from the immigration class and the podcast links to podcasts that they were creating, which something that my classes do regularly is now produce podcasts. So there's this whole kind of multimedia construction of storytelling that students had to think about in different locations at different times and coming together to construct something that they probably wouldn't see finished during the time of their class. Like most of these aren't complete until a semester and in some cases even until the following year. But just the opportunity to have something like this, I thought was they felt was a powerful way. And you know, these QRs are linked to, for instance, some of the assets and so forth if people wanted to do so. So if there's anybody on Zoom, you could use and check those assets if you wanted to do some yourself. As I mentioned, the abstract was a way again to propose and to tell us initially what you're planning on doing. I'll go rather rapidly to these parts. I just want to, because I want to get to Natalie describing her experience. The questionnaire, what we use for the questionnaire here, because most people, again, we're not trained as oral historians, but the power of oral histories here is to make sure that we collect the stories by thinking about the stories and the questions we ask. And we read Mireya Loza's Defining Braceros, a book, good friend and colleague Mireya Loza, that used one of the most powerful archival oral history archives that has been built, especially over the last 20 years. And it's the Bracero Archive Project out of University of Texas at Basel. It's a tremendous amount of recordings, images, lesson plans, things that it's an amazing database that people can hear. Many people that are no longer with us and their stories about being bracero, and the families themselves, especially as during the early 2000s, there was a whole movement to recover wages that were taken from them by Mexican and US government. And so using Dr. Loza's book and also the questionnaire from the Bracero program, the actual questionnaire that they conducted when they interviewed Bracero programs, people were able to be inspired and motivated on what to ask and what a professional oral history questionnaire looks like. And I think that's important, given that our students, again, sometimes limit themselves in terms of the questions they want to ask and how they respond. And again, asking someone to create open-ended questions is, you know, it's much harder than we think. We want people to storytell, and if our families are like my family, they'll be very brief. And they're like, pues así era. And you're like, pues así era qué? And you want to be able to expand on that. You want them to be vivid. All those moments that they have been vivid in describing those things, and how we wish we would have recorders during those vivid times, yeah. And we talked about interview techniques on how, especially since many of them are going to be recording on their phones or other devices, how having or making sure that you have clear audio, because even though I don't ask for the audio, they would have that audio for themselves. This is what, again, I would die to have audio my grandparents. Yeah. And so that the ability to think about recording, the seriousness of recording, of keeping them, of archiving that, I think is an important part of, again, this project, something that we asked for them to take notice of. And again, many of the testimonies of the final product as they shared it with family members, I think have been, for me, one of the amazing contributions, because I've had students, former students, Grecia Resendes, who graduated also with her master's from here, always mentions to me how her family was just in tears at having seen their story on as a part of this project. And she was actually the first one who motivated me to actually make it as a paperback, because she sent it in the entire journal, the online one too, and made it her, she made one specifically in paperback for her family. And so it was this kind of sense of like, even though the journal first was as an online journal, something that could be visible anywhere in the world. Eventually, especially this year, we've now created them as paperback for people. And I wanted to transition to sharing or introducing Natalie Salcedo, who took the course last year and contributed in the most recent volume of this project. Yeah, Natalie, do you want to you want to come up here? Or
do you want to chair? Or actually, I might. This thing. Okay, say something.
Yep. Also.
Hi everybody, my name is Natalie Salcedo. I'm a third year Chicanx Studies major. I had the honor of taking Dr. Gonzalez's class a year ago for fall semester, where like my dad, we had always talked about how it would be beautiful to be able to collect the memories and the experiences and interactions that we have with the people around us, especially like my grandparents. I am fortunate enough to have both my grandparents on my paternal side still with us. And I always talk about how much I admire my grandmother for being a pillar in my family. She literally holds together my family on my dad's side. And so when this was introduced in our class, I immediately knew who I wanted to interview for the oral history. And I knew it was going to be my grandmother. And I knew this because she has such a passionate way of sharing her experiences. She is so good at storytelling. Like if you sit with her, you will want to sit with her for hours and you will just be enthralled by the way that she describes her childhood, her experiences, the way that she grew up, how she raised her children. And she covers everything. Like she covers the good, the bad, the ugly. Like she has been through so much, and it has made her the woman that she is today. And so I knew that I wanted to capture that within this oral history. So again, I first started by creating a outline of like the questions that I would want to ask for the oral history. I split it up into a few sections, which I wrote down, which started with some basic questions, asking her to introduce herself, about her birthday, where she grew up, her siblings. I asked her about her life in Mexico, prior to getting married, prior to having kids, and even just some of the experiences that she had. I also asked her, a difficult question of why she decided that the family should migrate to the States. I asked her about the journey itself, which for those of you who have family members who may have experienced migration, you know that it can be a very difficult conversation for them to have, and oftentimes a conversation that they don't want to have at all. And then the last sections were arriving to the US and also like their life in the US now. So once I created these questions, I knew I was ready to go into this interview process with my grandma. But I was also nervous because, you know, what am I going to learn about her? And will she feel comfortable enough to share her experience with me? And as I mentioned, like she's been through a lot. Stuff that, you know, sometimes we can't even imagine or fathom experiencing. And so I wanted to make sure that I had made it a comfortable enough space for her to share her experiences without also, you know, kind of sending her into a spiral. I think now it is also important for me to note that my grandmother also has dementia. So I realized that this was the perfect opportunity for me to capture her memory and her essence before it unfortunately becomes too late. And so I told my dad and I was like, hey, like I would like to interview my grandma. And he was very excited because we've had experiences where we go to my grandma's house and she's just talking and joking and we just pull out our phone and we just press record and we record the interaction that we have with her, the laughter that she has or the way that she makes other people react. So he was very excited. So around, I want to say Thanksgiving of last year, I had gone home and I told my dad, I was like, I'm gonna sit down with her and I'm gonna have the interview. And I actually used like mics like these as well to record the interview. And it was funny because I sat down with her and I was like, okay, grandma, like, we're gonna record the interview and you have to use this mic. And she was like, yes, eso, like, what is that? And I was like, it's okay, like, you just have to speak into it. And throughout the interview, she would sometimes forget and then she would like knock it and then she'd be like, I'd be like, grandma, no lo toques, don't touch it. And she's like, oh, okay. But we started the interview. We sat in a room in one of my uncle's houses, literally just right next to each other. And I just went on asking her questions. I didn't take any notes because I was recording it. So I just sat and really wanted to be in the moment asking her questions. I also didn't just go completely off of the original questions I had made. I also, you know, asked her follow-up questions, which again goes to like what Dr. Gonzalez had mentioned, that oftentimes, you know, they need a little bit more encouragement on what else they can share about their experience. And so it was really beautiful to learn more about my grandmother and just like be able to sit with her in like her femininity and her masculinity, her maternalness, and have her share all of her experiences with me. And I would also be doing a disservice, I think, to the oral history if I didn't mention, you know, the emotional heaviness that comes with this process. It's a beautiful thing to capture the essence, the history, the experience, and the memory of an individual, especially someone who is so important in your life. But it's hard, and it's heavy. Sorry, I cry a lot, so if I start crying, don't worry about it. But as I mentioned, my grandma has dementia, so going through this interview was difficult because I could tell that she was struggling to remember certain things. I would ask her things and she would take the time and then she would sometimes say, no me acuerdo, or I don't remember. And that was heavy and difficult to hear because once you reach the point where the person who holds that knowledge doesn't have it, it's gone, you know, and you can hear it from accounts from other people, but you won't hear it from the source itself. And so that was also difficult. And I think also it's very bittersweet because in the actual oral history that I put into the journal, you can see different aspects of her memory and also her loss of there was a section in the interview where my dad had walked into the room and he had asked like, "Como va? Like, how's it going? Like, is everything okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, we're good." And he walks away. And she turns and she looks at me and she goes, "Who was that? ¿Quién era?" And I was like, "That's my dad." And she was like, "¿Quién es tu papá?" And I was like, "Tu hijo." Sorry. And that was really hard, you know, see, too. Just even like getting that, thank you. Even capturing that in the interview that she was forgetting. And not just forgetting like, you know, history, but her own family members, her children. So it was hard, and I can't imagine how my dad feels, you know, reading this interview, and seeing that part itself as well, like the actual capturing of a memory loss. So yeah, it is heavy. It is heavy, but I think that we owe it to ourselves, to our families, to our memory, to honor things like this, to honor the people who have made us who we are. Once I finished the interview, I sat with her for, I want to say like 2.5 hours, just asking her questions. I had the interview all done, the audio was made, and I had come back to Berkeley after Thanksgiving break, and it was time to create the transcription of the interview. And so oftentimes you can use like AI tools, like digital tools to help with transcribing audio into text. But I also knew that, you know, the interview was in Spanish. A lot of AI tools don't really use Spanish. And on top of that, like there was some slang thrown in there and some certain aspects of the conversation that weren't going to translate entirely well. So I decided that I would sit through the 2.5 hours of this interview and I would write it all out by hand. And I spent quite a long time doing that. One of my closest friends is here and I would take her to the library and she'd be like, "What are you working on today?" And I'm like, "I'm working on the same thing I was working on yesterday." But I think it was definitely a labor of love and I don't regret it by any means. And I now have, I think it's like a 20-page long document of the entire interview with my grandmother. Which I then ended up, you know, picking certain parts and sections that I wanted to include into the journal. And they were really crucial parts of my grandmother's history and what she shared that I wanted to make sure to include. I thought to myself, I was like, if my family members, my dad, my uncles and my aunts were sitting in a room, like what would I want them to know and have in an attainable way about their mother? And that's what ultimately led me to selecting each of the sections. Another thing was that, as I mentioned again, she has dementia, so she was forgetting. And sometimes if she did answer, some things weren't correct, especially in terms of like asking other people about the same thing and they'd be like, "No, well, this happened here." For example, I asked her like when she got married to my grandfather and she said a specific date, and then I asked him, who he has a bit more memory, and he's also very good with dates. He was like, "No, this is when we got married." And so there are sections in my part of the journal where I put like a little excerpt that's like, after talking to my grandfather, I realized that this is the correct date. And there's certain sections throughout that have been clarifications of what she has shared. But again, it wasn't that I wanted to like take away what she had already said, but I think adding to the ability to see like what she had said versus what is quote unquote true, just really captured the essence of her oral history. So yeah, I submitted it. I wrote the final abstract for the journal, which was also a very emotional process. I wrote the abstract and was also just like in tears not only seeing like the culmination of the work that had taken so long to create, but also the fact that like I had created a piece of my family's history that would always be there. The actual audio file of me interviewing my grandmother and having an interaction with her, the photos that are included in the journal, and the actual like written word of her interview and her experiences. It was very emotional. And so, I turned it in and I went home for winter break, and I told my dad, I was like, hey, like I finished the assignment. And I told him, I was like, I'm not gonna publish the journal for like another semester or so, but you can read like what I wrote. And we were sitting at a Cane's, we were eating lunch, and I like gave him my phone so he could read like the abstract. And he started crying. And while my dad is a very emotional person, I've never seen him cry before. And in that moment, I saw him as a little boy, you know? I saw him as a little boy, like acknowledging his mother's existence, the maternal force that has made him who he is today and who has made me who I am today as well. And I think that really brought us closer as well, and further taught us like how important it is to appreciate the people around us and their experiences. And during this time, there was a little bit of like turmoil within my extended family. But after I had shared with them, after the journal came out and my dad shared with them like the digital copy of the journal, I noticed that my family was brought together a lot more. And I can't say for sure that it was a direct outcome of the journal, but I think because I know a lot of them did read it and reached out and shared to me how beautiful they thought it was that their mother's words were on paper. But I think they also realized like how limited time is, and recognizing that you have the ability to visit your mom, your grandmother. You have the ability to just pull your cell phone out and press record, to have a memory, a voice of their experiences and the time you spend with them. So yeah, I'm very grateful again to Dr. Gonzalez for giving me this opportunity. And it is something that I will treasure forever. I open it to this day and still, tear up seeing, quotes from my grandmother's interview on there, or picture in the book. Like, it's a really beautiful thing. And although it was a very emotionally difficult process for me, I don't regret it, and I would do it all over again if it meant capturing the essence of my family, not only for myself and for my parents, but for generations to come within our family.
And trust me, we don't do it for. Everybody tells me that in my classes, everybody always starts crying, but it's not intended. But when the personal becomes something of an investment in both, how you, there has to be a personal investment when we're talking about education. We're often not seeing ourselves as a part of a community that sends us here to share so much of ourselves. We don't think we're the healers of our families, but our stories are the tools and are able to do so. They do have the power to do so. And the ability for us to share what we want and what we don't want, right? It's not always, I know there's been a lot of my students who have shared only bits and pieces of the oral history, and I said, that's totally fine. I don't want your families to think that somehow there's we're benefiting from that in any extractive way. No, you decide what you want to say and how you want to say it, or your families in terms of sharing. And I think that's important because again, the goal here is for you to have that for your family, for yourself, especially for those who do the oral histories. The photo collections have been part of that in the construct. One of my former students' mother, And the very collection of these stories, I think, includes now the photos, which it didn't before, is like such an amazing story within the story, yeah. Because the photos have this ability to contextualize these oral histories and projects in ways that I didn't expect. And what I was telling students to do was to think about that as a way of storytelling. Should work. Where you could also storytell and pictures within the picture. And be able to, again, to give a different kind of understanding of it. And people have added, for instance, and this one is even cooler because the butterflies start flapping, but it allows for folks to add the audio element and hear parts of the of songs, especially many of the songs are like songs that reflect their oral history or their project, parts of the audio from the interview, add other photos and a collage, create some kind of special effect. It gives it a different nature to the oral history than just the written word, which is just as powerful. And this is only available because of the technology that we were able to use from the initial grant, the Creative Discovery Grant, and that we've been now using in terms of having students develop that in the journals. This one is also released if they can get that. Now, it's hard to hear, of course, because of the noise, but it's part of the oral history. Yeah. I'm telling you from the oral history itself. And again, that is something that you'll have and have the opportunity to hear and so forth as students really become creative in the way that they want to do that aspect of it. Yeah. I'll end. I know that we're short on time, but I wanted to mention that this journal is not an easy thing to finish. Initially, it was I had some seed money to give to a graduate student who helped me with the initial editing of the first volume, and also with one of my work studies in the second volume. But it's been a very difficult one because it's not something that I can take on and do like full 100%. I have to do a little bits and pieces, especially if I want to get it out by the end of the spring semester. So most of these oral histories are collected this semester as the final project. And then by the end of the spring, we should have, for instance, the new volume. I found the way a little bit more better to kind of move around pieces, not students, but pieces, and to help with the editing process and make sure that all the formatting, because it is difficult to create something like this. The one thing about creating an online format, I will say, is that you can constantly revise and update, especially if there are errors that that we come across and so forth. And that's something that I find that the online format allows for. And it's been a helpful format in that regard. The one thing is that a lot of the collages that you see in front of the different versions were created by, of course, I would say world-renowned, famous Jesus Barraza, one of our professors in Chicanx and Latinx Studies, who initially I said, Jesus, what do you think? Can you help me do this cover? Because he's done these kinds of things for other kind of periodicals and so forth. And he made this amazing collage, and I was like, I'm coming to you every other month because I think it's a showcase to have him and others to create it. And he just gives it a personal touch, I think, in the collage. He just asked me, which images do you feel like you should put on there? And as you see from the covers, I think they've come out really beautiful. And I'm sure that, not that I know how it's gonna come out, but I'm sure that the 2025 version is going to be the same. Again, it includes all, especially when it's an online version, it includes the links for podcasts that are embedded from the class. It includes so much of the materials. It is, again, a labor of love. It is definitely something that's created among students. There was a second edition to this last 2024, and that was a comparte. A Zapatista from my Zapatista class was in the class. Sara was here for a second, but a couple of other folks were in the class. And in that, they were able to create a written piece, a podcast, and a print, something that they created as an actual like screen print. We actually printed those out. We were able to do so. Jesus Barasa helped with that. And he gave us a workshop on how to create prints. He's the master printer. And it includes poems, it includes written pieces, it includes denuncias. I mean, it's a beautiful tapestry of just different works that folks made. It also includes 2 children's books that students made from the class. So this one was actually a really cool project because it was just an explosion of different ideas and things, especially the latter half of it, which is these amazing prints that have different topics and that show the inspiration of the class in the students' work. Finally, why, right? The question is why do this? And for me, again, as Natalie has shown through her words and her sharing, that it's for you all and your families. That knowledge doesn't have to be held in one place. It can be shared, and it can be particularly shared amongst our families when we know that our stories are often in relationship to the maintaining of borders. That is what we share, how we share, what we forget, what in our lifespan happens to those stories if we don't collect them and hold them dear. That living archive aspect to me is, I think, such an important part of how we understand, for instance, the Latin American tradition, in particular, testimonials and the archive. And I think that is, in regards to our families who cross borders, and also who, as we were talking about in my class yesterday, who are inspected, monitored, and so forth by borders. So this is a way to respond to that through our stories. It's also to make sure that our curriculum that we produce in the university also produces something that students feel can be shared and used as a tool, as a learning exercise for younger generations, but also for older ones in this case as well. And I think this is what grounds us in ethnic studies and in Chicanx and Latinx studies, storytelling. Storytelling, especially, we have, for instance, Professor Pablo Gonzalez, who writes about creative writing and storytelling, and a lot of the work that he does on performance and so forth and education, in Salvador as well. And so all these folks who produce and help produce knowledge, it's about, again, reaffirming our stories, but also responding to what we're facing at the moment. And that's always a part of what our Digna Rabia is. It's about how we respond to not only the attacks on our communities, but also in making sure that one of the main weapons that we wield is our story. Not to destroy, but to create, right? And to create possibility of. So with that, I thank you, everyone. And if there's anyone who ever needs assistance in doing it, so yeah, I'm open totally to helping you all, give you any of the kinds of materials and assets that we use, and to also share this work, because I would love to see more opportunities and projects like this to come out of our classrooms and that our students and communities are building. So thank you.
We have time for a couple questions, and if you need to leave and run to class, that's also fine.
Yeah.
When is your class offered, that you this project?
This one is offered in the fall. And it's it's under Chicano Studies, it's Chicano Studies 159. And it's called, it's in the books called Mexican Migration, but there's no way that you can talk about Mexican migration at this moment without talking about Central American migration. So unofficially, it's Mexican and Central American migration. I've incorporated like ideas for some of my other classes, so I would expect that in the spring, I'll probably do something similar with my intro to Chicanx exposure class. So similar to that. The children's books, for instance, are in my intro to Chicano history class. So there's definitely the development of projects, but for this particular one, especially the journal, it's in the fall. I know there's some students here that or students taking the class, but also you're a part of the compacto. Yeah. What was your experience?
I thought it was really beautiful. I think that as a student, specifically at K through 12, K through community college, public education, I never really saw our like testimonials, our experiences, our faces within the archive. The archive was always a very like binary like place. So having a chance to contribute to an archive that highlights and uplifts. And also I'm taking Mexican and Central American migration semester. So to continuously, contribute to the archive and nurture that history community with all of us, it's such a beautiful experience.
And you for the Zapatista, the Comparte journal, you and Sara wrote a piece in solidarity with the Otomi indigenous peoples that are doing an ocupa in Mexico City, which we had met in March, right? Yeah, so it's always connected to something that we have been already starting to work on and do. Any other questions? Thank you all. Thank you for sharing the space. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing.
And if you're interested in any of these paperback, just let me know. I can then put in an order to Barnes and Noble site. They're initially right now at Barnes and Noble. I'm trying to find a more independent press, but right now.